Hello to all our viewers and listeners. My name is Peter, and I want to introduce Michelle, who is my co-editor at West England Bylines. It's my great pleasure today to introduce the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve. I expect he probably needs no introduction for most of you because he has a very distinguished and really outstanding career over a number of years. One thing I'm pleased to say is that he's an Oxford graduate, having studied modern history at Magdalen College. And so I'm sure he will have memories of our region. By profession, he's a barrister. And in 1997, he became Conservative MP for Beaconsfield, a seat which he held until 2019. During the Blair years, he spent some time being Shadow Home Secretary. And then under David Cameron, he was Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. Later, he was chair of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee and was responsible for the Russia report, among other things, something about which perhaps we'll have something to say. He played a historic role during the 2017 to 2019 Parliament as co-leader of a daring cross-party revolt to capture control of the Commons and prevent a no-deal Brexit, and was a leading light very much in the campaign for a people's vote. After leaving the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and I think many people would say that it left him, he stood in the 2019 election in his own seat against a Tory candidate, and has continued to fight the good fight. He left Parliament at that time and has moved on to other things, including being co-president of the European Movement. He's also president of the Franco-British Society, and among his many distinctions, he was awarded the Légion d'honneur by the French government. The most recent phase of his career is as an academic, and he lectures, among other places, in Goldsmiths, where he's a visiting professor. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dominic. Hello, Dominic.
Good morning.
So I'd like, if I might, to start with a question about current events. And that is to say the collapse of the trial of Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry on charges of spying for China. I know you've been on the media talking about this. What is your take on the current situation in that regard?
I remain totally puzzled by this story for a number of reasons. Firstly, I have absolutely no doubt that China is a threat to the United Kingdom. I was chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. We started an inquiry into China as a threat just before I stood down in the Parliament ended in 2019. It was completed by my successors. And to my no great surprise, the report is absolutely crystal clear about the threat that China poses to our democracy, to our freedom and our way of life. It's a quite insidious threat and a long-term threat. It's not like Russia as a military threat. But it is a threat nevertheless, and it includes subversion and really determined attempts by the Chinese to subvert UK public life to their way of thinking in ways which are, in many cases, unlawful. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that, leaving aside the question as to whether these two individuals had done the things that are alleged against them, and they have now been found not guilty by virtue of no evidence being offered against them, that I would have expected the foundations for such a prosecution, namely that China was an enemy, would be quite easy to establish. And I've really no idea why this didn't happen. And what's been said about it remains even more puzzling in my view, because the fact that it may not have been classified as an enemy state seems to me to be quite irrelevant. The key question is an official coming along and saying the official government position is that China is a threat, and these are the reasons in outline why that's the case. And whilst that might cause some embarrassment to our relations with the Chinese, I don't think the Chinese are naive. They know what we know. Quite apart from anything else, they'll have read the Intelligence and Security Committee report, which details and sets out what in 2019 to 2022 constituted the nature of China's threat. So the refusal of senior officials, apparently, to swear such a witness statement and produce such a witness statement remains utterly mystifying. And I simply don't understand what's happened. I mean, it's been suggested that the government didn't wish to antagonize the Chinese and therefore wasn't going to sanction one of their officials doing this. But I don't really understand that. And the government denies it. And the officials obviously haven't spoken about their own positions. But I would have expected the officials to have responded to what the government told them. And if the Attorney General had said to the Prime Minister, we need a statement, and the Prime Minister had said to the National Security Advisor, there clearly is a need for a statement, I am mystified as to why such a statement couldn't then be produced.
Well, I think it's a very thought-provoking answer, and thank you for that. I mean, it slightly preempts my next question, which is, do you think actually either the Sunak government or the current government could have or should have acted differently?
It's impossible to say. That the Sunak government, I must assume, was willing or must have considered itself willing and able to produce such a statement from within the Cabinet Office, or the prosecution ought never to have started. What I don't understand is the suggestion that, oh, well, we can't go back retrospectively to what happened in 2021 or 2022 or 2019 or whatever it was, because at that time the government hadn't classified China as an enemy state. Because I myself doubt that the issue of it goes round the classification. What's required is evidence produced in court saying China is a threat to us and we would treat it as an enemy state for these purposes because it does X, Y, and Z. But as I say, the matter remains murky, and I have to accept that I might be wrong about it. I just do find it very, very odd, and I don't understand how this situation was allowed to arise in the first place, because clearly if this was a problem at the outset, the prosecution should never have been commenced.
Thank you, Dominic. Over to Michelle.
Thanks, Peter. More foreign affairs. I was just wondering what your take on the current position in the Middle East is, and specifically, very recently, what hope you have for the ceasefire.
I'm obviously delighted with the ceasefire. I think any right-thinking person is going to be, and the release of the Israeli hostages, and the release by the Israelis of a large number of people they had detained in the course of their military operations, and indeed some people who they had prosecuted earlier for crimes. But the question is, where does this all go? Clearly, the ideal for Gaza is firstly that Hamas has no role in its governance. Secondly, that it is able to get governance set up and the necessary reconstruction for the population, and progressively a lessening of the tension with Israel so that some of the barriers can come down, because effectively and economically, these two places, Israel and Gaza, are likely to remain interconnected forever, just in the same way as there is a need to be free passage between Gaza and Egypt, which of course doesn't currently occur. And indeed, the Egyptians are very reluctant to let it happen, partly because they don't like Hamas. Despite everything else, Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood that the Egyptian government is extremely hostile to. And frankly, I think for some understandable reasons, although the Egyptians themselves hardly run a democratic state. So that's the first thing. But then in the background to all this is the situation in the West Bank, which is continuing to worsen, and where the Israelis are continuing a policy that looks as if it's moving towards annexation and the creation of Bantustans, effectively, for the Palestinian population, which is completely unacceptable. And unless there is a resolution of the West Bank, then a long-term solution to peace in Israel-Palestine is simply not going to happen. And I think it's worrying that there has been absolutely no focus on this. Trump doesn't appear to be interested in what's going on in the West Bank. The Israelis don't want anybody to be interested in what goes on in the West Bank, but people are going to continue to be so interested. I'm pleased the government has recognized Palestine as a state. Long overdue, in my view. It should have happened years ago. And the reluctance of successive UK governments to do this was always on the basis, oh, we want to do it in the middle of a peace process. But at the moment, the peace process is as far away as ever even if there is a Gaza ceasefire. We were right to do that recognition, and I completely reject the argument that the recognition somehow gives legitimacy to Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. The recognition of Palestine as a state, as an entity, does not imply recognition of Hamas in any shape or form, and nor should it.
No, absolutely. I was just thinking about the I found that quite frustrating, the fact that the Palestinian state was only recognised due to Israel's conduct. I found that a really odd way of doing it. I mean, either you recognise the state or you don't. And actually, for Starmer to trail it a few months in advance to say, well, it kind of depends what Israel does now, I kind of found that really odd. I mean, I guess it was a compromise. I guess it was a way of trying to recognise Palestine without setting all the alarm bells off at the time. But it felt really odd to me. If I was a Palestinian, I'd be like, well, do I have a state? Do I not have a state? It felt like a moral argument rather than, you know, something practical. But you know, I guess it's realpolitik, isn't it? I'm just wondering whether you thought that the situation in Palestine would have been affected positively if there had been the ability for Western journalists to be there. I mean, time and again, we heard the Israeli government saying that all the information coming out of Palestine was due to Hamas propaganda, and yet we didn't really have any alternatives. So the fact that we just could not see on the ground anything that was indisputable fact, do you think hampered the peace process in any way?
I don't know whether it had an impact on bringing about the ceasefire, but I have no doubt that if there had been journalists on the ground from responsible Western newspapers operating in a democratic and free framework, it would have been helpful, although they would also have been a very considerable risk. So how easy it would have been to do that reporting, I don't know. And clearly, both sides have exploited propaganda for their own purposes. I have no doubt that Hamas has sought to exaggerate Israeli actions, in particularly actions against civilians, and equally I'm quite sure that Israel has sought to minimize the amount of destruction towards the civilian population which its military operations have carried out. Israel does have a rule book, I'm fairly certain about that, although as we saw with the disgraceful episode of the public rioters turning up to prevent the arrest of Israeli soldiers who were accused of serious war crimes, you can also see that, in fact, Israel's democratic and legitimacy as a free and democratic country is, I think, in question, and indeed has shown considerable fragility during the course of this conflict.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have, isn't it? I've just been musing on the idea of proscribing Palestine Action in terms of people in this country who are supportive of the Palestinian cause. I mean, do you think that's a valid thing for the government to have done, given the conduct of Palestine Action?
It seems to me that Palestine Action's behaviour certainly brought it within the definition of the Terrorism Act. You cannot, in a free society, say that the way you are going to achieve your aims is not just by lawful demonstration, but actually by committing acts of criminal damage against targets that you consider are representative of an alternative point of view. And that way is anarchy. And so Palestine Action undoubtedly had turned itself into an organisation which, although it said it wasn't going to direct violence against individuals, met the test of the Terrorism Act. Now, that still leaves open the question as to whether it was wise to prescribe it, because by prescribing it, it was an invitation to people to go out on the streets and say, I support Palestine Action. Now, it's a pretty stupid thing to do, because Palestine Action is not supporting Palestine or supporting the Palestinians. But it has created a public order problem, which I think was fairly predictable, and is going to have to be dealt with. And I suspect most of those who have done this will end up being fined and nothing more will happen. Actually, the people who are doing the criminal damage could have been prosecuted even if the organisation had never been proscribed. And indeed there are, and let's face it, there are around a number of organisations where individuals get prosecuted for committing criminal offences which have not been proscribed as a consequence. So it was ultimately a political choice that the government made.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Peter, would you like to move on to the next one?
I want to turn the clock back a little bit and talk about your role in the campaign to remain within the European Union. I know this is gradually receding into the past, but I think many of us feel that Brexit is not a done deal and never will be. But perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about how all that felt for you.
It was a very painful period, really. Painful because it severed links. I'd been a Conservative Party member for 47 years, I think, up to 2019 when Johnson threw me out. And of course, it created tensions for my own relations with my members of my own association, people who I liked and valued and respected. And it created tensions within Parliament, although Parliament actually managed those tensions on the whole pretty well. Colleagues tend to be quite tolerant of each other, but it was a stressful period, and there were death threats. There were, people sending me emails saying they wanted to come and chop my head off. The Daily Mail published quite gratuitously a photograph of my house in France and identified its location. So I got people coming along and saying, "Oh, we know where it is now, and we're going to come and kill you while you're there." This was all just extraordinary, and also the irrationality that surrounded so much of the debate was painful to watch. Although I have to recognise parliamentary democracy is messy. You can't always expect it to be like a seminar on a subject, and people's emotions were heavily engaged, and people's identity was engaged. I didn't find it easy, quite apart from anything else. I had to constantly say to myself, are you doing this because you're angry about this, or are you doing something or taking a step because you think it might lead constructively to a solution? And I have to accept that at times it was quite difficult to necessarily disentangle those things because one's own emotions are involved. But my own view was quite consistent, which was that Brexit was going to be really damaging to the United Kingdom's future, its future as a nation and its economic future. And nothing that's happened since persuaded me that I got that wrong. Indeed, it seems to me that those of us who pointed this out were correct. And at all times, what I was aiming to do was to try to get a second referendum. I know nowadays it's become slightly fashionable to say, oh, no, Grieve wasn't trying to get a second referendum. He was trying to stop it dead in its tracks, to deny the will of the people. But it isn't true. I was trying to get a second referendum, and I had to acknowledge that there was a risk, and actually I think quite a considerable risk, if it had a second referendum, say in early 2020, that the verdict might have been the same. But I still thought it would be useful because at least it gave people the opportunity to reflect on the enormity of the steps that we were about to take and on the fact that already by 2019, what we were going to get and what was on offer was radically different from what people were suggesting who promoted when they promoted the Leave campaign at the time of the referendum. So for me, that was the justification for doing it. I was always aware that it might at the end of the day not work. But it was dependent on holding, ultimately, Boris Johnson's feet to the fire. And as Jeremy Corbyn quite gratuitously decided not to do that, it was the end. And the end, when it came, was rather predictable, because if in any runoff between Corbyn and Johnson, it was quite clear Johnson was going to win.
The second referendum, you speculate on the outcome. I think I remember the date I think it was February 2018, I may be wrong, when the demographic change that had occurred since the referendum was such that the majority of people would actually have voted the other way without anybody changing their minds. And I think it seems fairly clear now that opinions have changed quite radically, although the polarity hasn't gone away. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on what it was that, what were the factors that led to the campaign for a second referendum not being more successful, given the strength of the people like yourself who were fighting. And I appreciate your point about Corbyn, But was there anything else that could have been done to make it happen?
I think ultimately, well, it was about Corbyn. It's inescapable. The high point, because there was a certain inevitability about some of the phases of this. And the first phase, I suppose, was it possible to persuade Theresa May to reach out to the opposition and say that we needed to have a second referendum when she ran into huge difficulties over her deal? She may have been tempted, but in fairness to her, I think she always had a huge loyalty to the Conservative Party and its ideals, although the Conservative Party is now, I'm afraid, broken and destroyed as a result of all this. But she didn't wish to be the immediate instrument of its destruction. And therefore, I don't think it was a step that she was ever prepared to take. And it may also, in truth, have been a step that was contrary to her own conscience and instincts in light of what the referendum result had been. Yeah. But when she went and Johnson became Prime Minister, it was immediately apparent, first of all, that Johnson would precipitate constitutional crises and that he was prepared to try to work in ways that were, frankly, unconstitutional to achieve his aims. The question then was whether Parliament could hold its nerve and see these things off. And obviously, you couldn't prolong that forever, because even I recognised you've either got to replace a government, Parliament can't substitute itself for a government. So there came a point where really the question was, Johnson's attempts blocked the Supreme Court judgment on prorogation, forced to require an extension until January against his wishes, thwarted from calling a general election. The question then was it possible to put something else in place that could take us in a different direction? And the only way that could have been done was by Labour abandoning Corbyn and getting a new leader, might have been Keir Starmer even then, who was prepared to put together a coalition government for the express purpose of going back to the British people and consulting them in a second referendum. Yeah. And right up to mid-October of 2019, I didn't think that was completely impossible, but it ran into a number of difficulties. The first difficulty was obviously Labour loyalties, asking them to Labour, as I think people are discovering, unlike the Conservative Party, have great difficulty getting rid of their leaders because of the way their constitution is put together. So axing Corbyn, who'd already had one motion of no confidence against him, as you'll recall, 3 or 4 years earlier, was always going to be difficult. But then on top of that, Corbyn quite gratuitously decided that he wanted to have a general election and persuaded himself that in this general election, he would repeat the performance of 2017 and be seen in some way as the people's champion, and that Labour would come out of it well. And of course, around the edges, there were also other political parties which also had potentially an interest in an early general election. The Liberal Democrats believed wrongly that they would do well in such an election. And in addition to that, the SNP believed possibly rightly that an election would be to their advantage. But in fairness, we were able to keep those groups on side, despite the fact that those temptations were luring them towards supporting the government. And it was ultimately Corbyn's decision which triggered the complete meltdown. And I knew that once we were heading for a general election, the chances of a general election being a suitable forum for determining the European issue were negligible, because as I discovered on the doorstep, and I knew this would happen when I was campaigning as an independent in 2019, I got lots of people who said to me, I'd really like to support you, but we can't afford to have Corbyn in Downing Street. He was so totally unacceptable. Pointless to point out, well, you could put me in Parliament, and I certainly wouldn't help put Corbyn in Downing Street. But it never works like that. That's not how general elections operate. People tend to vote for party and not for individuals, or indeed to make detailed choices about what it is they want.
Well, you mentioned the election of 2019. I have memories of walking along beside you, knocking on doors in Beaconsfield, And I think the single exchange that happened most frequently was, well, they would say, I like Dominic very much, he's a fantastic MP, but he's let us down. And I would say, well, actually, he hasn't left the party has left him. And he's still the same Dominic he voted for 2 years ago. But there we are. It almost worked, but not quite. So on that theme of the Conservative Party, I'll hand back to Michelle.
Yeah, I was just thinking actually that when you were talking about the emotive part of the referendum, in fact, I wasn't particularly, I was interested in politics, but not involved. I wasn't doing this kind of work or anything like that. And for me, it was a really transactional decision. Are we better off, practically speaking, in or out of an imperfect EU? And actually, I think that tracing it back, that might be the first time politics became really emotional and kind of, we suddenly became quite irrational and awful things happened, the murder of Joe Cox, etc. But actually, I think thinking back in my lifetime anyway, we're kind of unthinkable before that we would get quite so emotional about it. So I think it was a bit of a turning point. And I'm not sure we've ever really recovered from that. So that's just my thing. That's nothing to do with the Conservative Party as such. But I was watching an interview that you did with James O'Brien last year, and I'm a bit of a lefty, so I've never sat and thought about Conservative politics in the way that you described it, which was that belief that these sort of long lines of succession and inheritance created stability in a society, and that actually, if you balance that with the right interventions to make sure that people didn't fall off the end, that actually you believe that was what conservatism was all about. I just wondered whether you thought that's what the Conservative Party as it stands now represents, and if not, do you think there's ever a chance that they might get back there?
I certainly don't think they represent this now. They seem to have completely abandoned it. It's been a progressive abandonment and probably goes back over quite a long period. It's turned into an angry party. And a party which in many ways is quite revolutionary. You only have to look at Jenrick's posts on X to see that this is a form of populist anger being generated about change without actually coming up with any concrete or sensible or rational or reasonable solutions or moral solutions to the problems that have to be confronted. Now, in fairness to my old party, it adjusts, and it's entitled to adjust according to the problems. It's one of its great successes. And it's an unfortunate fact, and I don't think one which it itself has directly promoted, although it didn't do much about it when we were in office, that identity issues have become absolutely at the forefront of Western democratic politics, particularly in Western Europe. It's not just here. And that is due to immigration. I mean, there's no point in trying to avoid it. There is coupled with relative economic decline and uncertainty, people are behaving in a much more fearful way, and as a consequence of fear, more aggressive way towards the outside or towards the other, and finding it harder and harder to accommodate or develop or see positives coming from that. And the Conservative Party has reflected that, indeed Labour has. I mean, you can see it now happening with the Labour Party just as much as with the Conservatives, because ultimately you respond to your electorate. We don't live in an authoritarian bubble where we say we're the elite so people can think whatever they like, because they won't elect you. So they've shifted, but in shifting, they've adopted positions which are more and more incoherent. And of course, the single most incoherent one was in fact leaving the EU. Because being members of the EU was economically very advantageous to us. It's what turned the corner of declining Britain when we joined in the 70s. It took 10 years to kick in, but the evidence is overwhelming from all the data of the period that what it actually did, most notably, was to raise GDP per head by 10%. Living standards by 10% for everybody in the United Kingdom by the time we'd been in the EU, the EEC for 10, 15 years. It was the right decision to take. And in the same way, as I think Rachel Reeves has just admitted for the first time really, in an interview in the last couple of days, it may have been yesterday, that Brexit is damaging to our economy. So the Conservative Party adopted a policy, because ultimately it adopted it. I know that there was half of it didn't want it and half did. But once it had happened, adopted a policy saying that a policy direction, which was Brexit post-referendum, would deliver good results for the United Kingdom, which have turned out to be complete mirage. Indeed, we are damaged by it. So we are floundering economically, and that's a very bad place to start addressing the identity issues, which haven't gone away, and indeed which are getting greater week by week. And so the consequence of this is that it has turned my former party into, firstly, a sort of little Soreco of reform, which is outflanking them because it is making exactly the same arguments, except rather better, you could argue, because they aren't tainted by any period in government whatsoever and can be as irresponsible as they like about what they actually say. And that, coupled with the Conservative Party's failure, explains its current position, which is frankly catastrophic. And it's hemorrhaging support in both directions. So it is losing support to reform, which is the support which it used to enjoy from people who were probably quite traditionalist, and certainly in identity terms, but were prepared to go along with conservative liberal democracy and its principles. They're going off in one direction. At the same time, as we can see in seats, particularly in the south and southwest of England, the Conservative Party is hemorrhaging support mainly to the Liberal Democrats, but probably also to people who are simply not voting anymore, who find the policy positions of the party incomprehensible, irrational, and actually probably rather disgusting. So this isn't a very good place to end up. And I simply don't see how this is going to change unless there is some coming together within the party to recognise where our philosophical roots are and then to try to differentiate ourselves both from Labour and Reform and say, we do understand the identity concerns you've got. We can do sensible policies, but not wave magic wands about that. We can try to bring people together. People should look at the advantages that have come to us from some of the changes that have come about. And yes, we can take the tough decisions to get our economy starting again. But the trouble is, people don't trust the Conservatives on the economy because of their dire economic performance previously, any more now than I think they trust Labour. So this is quite a big challenge. The alternative, I think, is that they're simply going to end up with Jenrick as leader of the Conservative Party and will become a junior partner to Reform at the next election with a potential coalition should they have a majority afterwards, in which case the Conservative Party, as I understand it, and have always understood it, will be dead. And then the question is whether there is any chance of some new centre-right force emerging. But I have to admit that looking around Europe, it's not a very good picture. You think of the great Gaullist, which was, for all its nationalism, a centre-right movement in France. And Les Républicains, who are the heirs of it, have about 18% of the vote, which is, interestingly, where I reckon the Conservative Party looks to be heading, which is like a sort of an echo of a glorious past and may well lead to its extinction. So I'm not optimistic about it. I wish I could be, because firstly, I'm philosophically conservative. I'm not of the left. And I don't see myself in agreement with left-wing views on many principal views. Obviously, we agree on some other things. And frankly, we are, people like myself are orphans because there is really nowhere to go at the moment and no real prospect, no sign that somebody has sort of come to grips with this.
A very cynical person might say that the centre-right party that might emerge might be the Labour Party of new. So, you know, you might, if you hang in there, you never know.
But it might. Labour is in quite a strange condition as well. They are facing a huge challenge in what they see as their blue wall seats. And they're also facing a challenge from the left, the Greens, and from a more radical left, and they're finding it very difficult to pitch themselves. But economically, they are not a centre-right party. And I think that was very clearly shown in Rachel Reeves' first budget. The promises they made not to raise income tax were a terrible error, because we are short of money and borrowing is going to become very difficult. But the last thing you should be doing is raising national insurance if you want to boost business. And yet that's what she ended up doing, which was a very Labour thing to do. Business will be able to sustain, will be able to pay for the extra things that we want to provide by way of public services. And I'm afraid in the current state of business, this isn't going to happen. I also thought that Keir Starmer missed an opportunity, because when Trump came into office and was pulling the rug from under US support for Zelensky and the Ukraine, there was, I thought, an opportunity for the government to come to Parliament and say, look, we're now in a period of really serious international crisis. We know we're not spending enough on defence. We know public services are under enormous pressure. Taxes have got to go up, and therefore our promise on income tax has got to be changed. We can't sustain it. The situation is quite different. We need to borrow more, which we're undoubtedly going to have to do. We're going to need to tax more, and we're going to need to carry out really significant cuts to public services. And I think such a package would have been acceptable, curiously enough, to quite a broad swathe of the electorate. Obviously, the unions wouldn't have liked some aspects of it, and people who are dedicated to maximum public services, which in my view are unsustainable in the long term anyway, they would not have liked it either. But that, I think, would have repositioned Labour in a way that actually straddled the centre ground completely. But they have, at the moment, the problem that the economy is not working, however well-intentioned they may be. Reviving it, frankly, requires rebuilding links with the European Union, amongst other things. And it requires incentivizing business. And they have shown themselves very reluctant to embark on either of those two things. And it's regrettable, because they are the only show in town. I have no reason to wish ill for them, because frankly, as things stand at the moment, they are the only thing that's keeping the show on the road at all.
I think we could have a whole separate podcast about taxation, couldn't we? And progressive versus regressive, etc. So I'd better hand over to Peter before we run out.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I just want to change the theme a bit to the Russia report. Now, of course, we know there are some things you cannot say, but could you tell us what you think, from what is available in the public domain, about the lessons the Russia report may have for us today?
I think that the main lesson is that Russia really is an enemy country. I mean, we may not be at war with it, but it is really at war with us. It doesn't wish to engage in a direct conflict with us, but it wishes to do absolutely everything it can to undermine British society. It's quite cack-handed in the way it does it, and sometimes it fails pretty miserably. But it will seek to influence elections. It will seek to undermine democratic values. It exploits the internet, and particularly social media, to spread disinformation, raise bots, raise the profile of false stories, to try to persuade people that they really exist. And it engages in cyber sabotage, and indeed there is evidence also murder. So, I mean, it's a pretty long catalogue of bad behaviour, and indeed, and there is no sign that this is finishing, and indeed this has been growing. It is worse today. Sorry, excuse the clock in the background. Worse, my grandfather clock going off and striking 11. Just wait for it to finish. I'm down in the dining room today because my upstairs room was being used for other purposes. So anyway, so yeah, Russia is a threat, and it's a growing threat, but it's also a threat which can, in fact, be quite easily countered, particularly if European countries work together to do it. And the point has been made over and over again that economically, Russia, with 180 million people, is a complete pygmy compared to the EU and the United Kingdom, and even more so if you add in other NATO countries. So the idea that we should feel threatened by Russia is entirely the result of our own inactions and inactivity, and the fact that over many years we've placed excessive reliance on the United States for our security. And actually, there I have some sympathy with Trump's position.
Thank you. Do you think the government could be doing more at the moment to respond to this kind of aggression?
I think this government, and in fairness, its predecessors have called it out. Clearly, with Boris Johnson, there may have been some embarrassment because the evidence was pretty clear that in the days of the oligarchs, the Conservative Party, and indeed other political parties as well, were quite open to oligarchical influence and money, and didn't pay enough attention to the fact that from any person who, whilst there may be many people from exiles from Russia who have broken all ties with Russia, who are very good UK citizens. The fact of the matter is if you still have a foot in Russia, you dance to Mr. Putin's tune because he's a mafia boss. And you've got to understand that he has an agenda and doesn't see any distinction between an economic and political agenda when it comes to making use of the tools available to him in Western European countries, including Russians who are living here. So we've got to face up to that. What else should we be doing? We've got to spend much more on defence. Now, I realise that's a very difficult subject, particularly when people say we're not spending enough on the NHS, which some people might say is unaffordable. And in the long term, we cannot continue to maintain a health service in the character that we have at the moment. These are really big questions. But if the United Kingdom wants to be safe militarily from the threat of Russia, then we are probably talking about spending 4 to 5% of our GDP on defence. And that's what we have got to aim to do, and probably aim to do it quite quickly. Well, it's perfectly affordable, but that requires choices. Poland has a growing economy and is spending exactly that sort of sum on its defence because it takes it very seriously. So it's not as if it means that your economy then founders. Indeed, there is an argument that it will boost your economy if you do it properly.
Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I think this is going to be my last question because we're sort of running out of time. So it's going to be shamelessly self-regarding. So just wondered, so from where I sit, it feels as though the sort of mainstream news media is letting us down a bit in that we get, first of all, I think we've always had quite a lot of processy type stories about he said, she said in Parliament and nothing about the substance of arguments. But also this, and particularly from the BBC, depressingly, I find, is that this sort of unwillingness to actually challenge what somebody has said. I mean, and I'm sure politicians like that, but I just wondered whether you thought that there was a role for organisations like Bylines Network or other independent news media that are being set up all over the place at the moment. I discovered earlier this week Carol Cadwallader is just setting her own one up as well. So the people who've got background in news journalism who are kind of shedding the shackles of whatever organisation they've worked for and whatever bent that organisation has had. Do you think there's a future for that sort of thing, and whether we can actually have a role in holding power to account?
Yes, I do. I'm sure there is. And I agree with you about the analysis. The print media, frankly, with one or two notable exceptions, is, I think, a very poor purveyor of news and increasingly willing to allow space to people. Of course, you show a broad spectrum of views from your commentators, but people actually saying things which are, frankly, incapable of proper justification. It's become an entertainment, partly because they're under so much threat. I'm not so sure with the BBC. Perhaps I don't listen to it often enough. I do think it tries to be objective, but I also do agree that there seems to be a lack of ability to engage in in-depth discussion, and this goes back a long way. To my own experience of politics, you contrast Brian Walden, who used to do This Week, and you would sit down with a senior politician, and he'd be very polite to them, and he would say, welcome. He'd put them at their ease, and then he'd have a conversation, a little bit like the conversation we're having here. long enough for the person to develop their arguments, not trying to cut them off or try to sort of humiliate them or try to score points off them, but simply to ask the questions and to say, can you explain yourself? And my view is that was a very high standard of broadcast production. I remember interviews between Walden and Margaret Thatcher that I thought were just extraordinary. I mean, she loosened up, she spoke to him, you understood what she was saying. He challenged her. He said, well, you know, people are saying this, and she came back with her answers. Now, much as I liked him as an individual, you know, you go to Jeremy Paxman, who you used to have your 60-second soundbite on Newsnight, and it was like a sort of, it was sort of immediate death or survival. You know, he would bowl a googly. He had to score a point or make a hit in the first 60 seconds, and it was your job as the politician appearing for the party to somehow bat it off and get in your soundbite for 30 seconds, and then you were cut off. And frankly, that is where, to my mind, most of our media is now. I accept that Sunday morning television can sometimes be a little bit different with some of the more in-depth discussions, but they're not of the type, character, or scale that we used to have. And that's what we need, because quite apart from anything else, you know, politicians aren't magicians, and they're not miracle workers, and they all want, most of them, in my experience, want good for their country, they want to do their best. But in doing all those things, you know, they're human and frail, and they're going to make mistakes. And just because they make a mistake doesn't mean that they should be sacked or they should lose office, because everybody makes mistakes. You've got to understand what are the challenges they're facing and how they're trying to face up to it. And you can only do that if you have some in-depth conversations with them. And we're not getting it. Now, insofar as Bylines has been doing this quite successfully now for some time, it's a joy to see, because and it's not just my coming on to speak to you, but it's also the fact that I sometimes watch it with other people, and I think, yes, you're actually getting the views properly developed, and I think that we are lacking that very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just wondering there whether the media then has had a part to play in training politicians in how to behave, because I tend to complain quite a bit about politicians and sound bites and tell me the real story, and actually perhaps the news media has had some influence in that, in terms of that. The way you describe it is that it's almost like survival. So I've literally just got to plough ahead regardless, not explain myself, not complain, but just get that soundbite in. And that's kind of the losers then are the people that are watching on the other end and having to make a decision once every 5 years that needs to be informed for all of our sakes. So quite depressing.
Yeah, I think it's a great pity, because, as I say, we're losing a quality of debate and understanding. And I feel sorry for the politicians, because they've been sent in and they're told they must get their soundbite in, and they must prevent anybody derailing their soundbite. It's not very helpful.
Yeah. I'm not going to feel sorry for politicians, though. It doesn't matter.
No way. They volunteer for it. I just know they can go and do something else. You're quite right about that.
Thank you. And on that theme, I mean, hopefully we can persuade you at some point to write for Bylines Network. Certainly, we greatly appreciate your input. And I think it's quite symptomatic of what you just talked about, that some of the best journalists in the BBC have actually moved across to LBC, and not least the news agents who do a wonderful podcast. But my question really was about your co-presidency of European Movement UK. And just to ask you, what do you feel you'd like to have achieved in that role by the time you hand over to somebody else?
Privileged to be co-president. My fellow co-president, Caroline Lucas. We have different political background, but I have huge respect for her, and we work well together. We don't run the European movement, as you'll be aware. The European movement is run by an executive committee, and it has a chair, and the presidents are there, I suppose, as a sort of reserve in case something goes terribly wrong. But apart from that, we are there, I think, to front up the movement and to encourage people. And I enjoy doing that. So I travel around a bit. I sometimes do video conversations, a bit similar to the one we're doing here. And I also go around the country to branches and talk to them. And sometimes I do media, which is on behalf of the European movement in a sense, even though I may have been asked on in my own personal capacity. As you know, it's a growing movement. At one time, it had over 500,000 people, of course, in the early 1960s. And it really was a mass movement, which is where we need to get it back to. But of course, by 2016, it was about 500 people. They were sort of the dedicated Europhiles who either worked in Brussels or had worked in Brussels or in the European Parliament. But we're now 24,000 members. The problem that it has is that, of course, lots of people joined in the immediate aftermath of the referendum because they wanted a second referendum. They wanted to prevent us from leaving. And so there's an understandable impatience. There's a desire to go out and hold demonstrations to say, this is terrible, look at what it's done to us, it must be changed immediately. And I think part of my task, and I think it's also Caroline's, is that, Lucas's, is that we need to go and explain that these things, the world wasn't made in a day. I personally think that Britain's relationship with Europe is going to continue to progressively to get closer. I went to give a lecture last week about this in Luxembourg. Where we end up, I don't know, but it is so massively in the interest of both our European Union partner states and ourselves that this should happen. The trouble is that doing this from outside the EU is quite a challenge. And I think I would be happy. That's the challenge we have to face up to. And I would be very happy if when the time comes for me to cease to be the co-president, the movement has grown and continued to grow, that we are really a very large movement with a lot of influence and above all cross-party, because the whole point of it is it is a cross-party movement. It is a movement where people say, I can join this, even though I may be mixing with people from other political parties. And of course, one of the problems with Brexit is that's become harder to achieve. And that's what we should be aiming to do. And if I can help do that, then I'm delighted.
Thank you very much indeed. One very, very brief final question. Thinking about Ed Davey and the invitation to meet Donald Trump at Windsor. I don't know whether you received an invitation, but had you done so, would you have accepted it? And what are your thoughts?
I think from my point of view, if the king asks you to do something, you do it. Because it's his invitation, not Donald Trump's.
Do you want to say a quick word about Donald Trump before we finish?
Well, Trump is an extraordinary phenomenon and a very frightening one in many ways. And it's a problem that has to be managed. It also, we simply shouldn't dismiss it as just some eccentricity of Trump, because lurking behind that, there is a populist movement in the United States as fierce, if not fiercer, than some of the phenomena we're seeing here, and which I'm afraid is also, to my mind, a reflection of a lack of a collapse in confidence in Western democratic and free values. And you know, why do people go around with a cap on their head saying, make America great again, when an outsider might say, but you're already a very great nation. What is it that you feel you've lost? But it's clear that a lot of the people who are voting for Trump feel that something vital has been lost, and are prepared to be very angry and very violent in some cases in order to try and get it back. So Trump is a creature of his times, but we do need to manage him, because ultimately the United States remains very important to our defense. And if that were really to uncouple completely, we would be in very serious trouble. So I'm afraid it does require some adjustments, but one should be, as I say, one shouldn't be starry-eyed about this phenomenon at all. I don't think anybody in Britain is. I don't think Trump is a very popular figure, except with one or two elements of the far right.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dominic. So many questions we could ask, and we haven't touched upon your relationship with France, but that may be for another day. I'm aware there's so many things that we could be discussing there, but I'm aware time has run out, and therefore it just remains really to say thank you very much for giving your time and for being so expansive and so enlightening in what you had to say, and really enjoyed meeting you yet again.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
All the best now. Look after yourselves.
Bye.